wish we were chasing waterfalls somewhere in North Carolina. And I wish I was holding your hand while your hand was holding.
Tonight, we will continue on our topic of periodical cicadas with Caleb Corona of Reagle Beagle Fly Fishing. Caleb is an East Tennessee native, a fly fishing guide, commercial tire, and PhD entomologist. Join us as we nerd out on all things periodical cicada. Hey, Caleb, thanks a lot for taking the time. We appreciate it tonight.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. Glad to be a part of the community back there still. So, yeah, I appreciate the offer to come on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're here to talk to you about cicadas tonight, but I wanted to start with a little bit on you. You're from East Tennessee, so can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and give us a little background on your fishing history?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up about 5 miles from the shop. I grew up in Blounteville, kind of next to Central High School, fishing for about everything I possibly could. First fish was obviously probably bluegill. Starting out, I feel like a lot of the ways. My dad was really into the tournament bass fishing. Spent a lot of time on Boone and Patrick Henry. So those are definitely some of my first memories with a boat. He was started out as a pretty hardcore largemouth addict on all the lakes around there. And I feel like about when I was in middle school, he had a friend at work that took him out to the river for the first time for smallmouth. And that was about the last time I remember doing a whole lot of bass fishing on lakes. So it shifted to a river family pretty quick and, middle school and high school. And we'll talk more about it. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about kind of the more oddball species today. But my papaw was really into carp fishing and catfishing. So I kind of grew up stuck in between the bass guy and kind of the bottom fishing. So I kind of had a pretty big love for them both. So that was kind of glad I grew up that way and not super hardcore one way or the other. Did a lot of the stuff there in East Tennessee with the lakes and rivers too. I got my first fly rod when I was 13. I basically stole one from a guy at a farm pond and fished it all day. Caught a few largemouth and still touched the spinner rod a bit, but the fly kind of had my heart since then and really got into the carp thing. We're going to talk about cicadas at Steele's Creek, a pretty popular place there in Bristol. Thinking I was hot stuff, fishing a bread fly for the carps around there. So we, the Wonder Bread hatch would roll off there, in the evenings pretty strong and started throwing flies at those guys and kind of never stopped on the carp thing, still doing that. But yeah, and then we're going to talk obviously a lot about the entomology portion. Kind of grew up, Matt on your podcast last week talked about kind of growing up a bug guy. That was a pretty similar story for me too. I can remember like being younger, like running around mixing everything I could in the house. I used to call them to make potions to go around and kill all the ants that were on the sidewalks and stuff growing up there. So yeah, kind of grew up doing a little bit of everything fishing wise in that area, traveling down to Florida and stuff in the summers, but spent a ton of time on all the water there.
That's awesome. And I heard you worked for a few local shops back in the day?
Yeah, so my first job in school, this is my first, I feel like an old person take, back before the Bass Pro and Cabela's of Bristol. So when they opened the Bass Pro in Bristol, me and Stunkard, another fly fishing legend of East Tennessee, were the fly shop there. When they first opened it, neither one of us stayed too long, but I started working the fly shop at Bass Pro freshman year of college when I was at King. And then would spend every week and second hanging out in the fly shop at Mountain Sports. That was about 5 minutes from King. So between classes, I'd kill way too much time and spend the money that I didn't have at Mountain Sports all the time. And I owe Patrick Folkrod and Troy Runyon a lot of my fly fishing background, I'm sure. Patrick was kind of him and Rod champion from South Wilson, really got me into the whole fly fishing sphere. And then I met up with Troy pretty quick after it. And we always called it kind of my Jedi smallmouth training. Of Troy was my Obi-Wan for a lot of my life. I owe those guys a ton of getting me on this addiction pretty early on. And I was just kind of hanging out at Mountain Sports way too much, and eventually got the why don't you come over here and work for us instead? You're here more than you're a Bass Pro anyway. So I like to tell people it was kind of like a bidding war to see who could pay me the most, but that unfortunately didn't happen. So made the switch over and was in Mountain Sports for a few years while I was going to King. And then, yeah, ended up at King for 4 years, did my undergraduate degree there, and worked in mountain sports for a couple of years during that. And I was you could tell who was who at King. I was the only person that was pulling a boat to classes. So we would get, we would get out of, we'd get out of chemistry at like 4 p.m. and then we would drive to South Holston and fish the Spinner Falls most nights. So, uh, if I would be lying if I said my undergraduate choices of school wasn't a little bit river influenced, but yeah, spent a lot of time with the boat behind the trailer at class there.
That's awesome. So why did you move away, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, so grad school took me away from Tennessee. So when I was at King, I studied biology there. I worked in a toxicology lab. Dr. Vanessa Fitzinakis, pretty big deal in the field of toxicology. Growing up there, if you're listening to this podcast, not from there, it's a really big or was a really big tobacco producing industry. Still has some farm mixed around, but I grew up as the third generation on a tobacco farm. I've been in my family for a long time. That was kind of my first job, was cutting suckers off of tobacco with a machete that my papa gave me. So I grew up doing that, and then ultimately ended up losing my grandfather to some kind of brain diseases there, and I got really involved with toxicology and researching like the potential links between fungicides and herbicides that tobacco farmers used, and how that could ultimately lead to some of those diseases too. So worked in toxicology lab there. And it was time to graduate. I decided I wanted to pursue the further education in that, and was kind of debating whether or not I want to do the master's or PhD. And PhD was kind of always the end result, so I thought, why not skip to that first? So tried to go straight from undergrad into a PhD program, and found that to be pretty hard sell for most of the major professors out there. So I ended up at Iowa State University through some connections with King. So I moved out of Tennessee for grad school in Iowa. So I started doing toxicology. My research was focused mainly on moving towards more green chemistry, like botanical, plant essential oils, all the things that you hear all the time, all the news about, and how we could develop new repellents and insecticides that would, replace some of those more harmful, more toxic chemical means that are out there in the world. So that was the start of it. Did that for the first 3 years in grad school. And then my major professor came to me and said, you're one class away from being able to get an entomology major too. A lot of my research focused on mosquitoes and ticks and how we could better, a lot of my projects were like protecting soldiers. So it was if we could add repellents to clothing when they were going to be in mosquitoes or sandfly environments to kind of keep soldiers safer. And that ultimately had a lot of carryover. We did a lot of work with repellents, like with malaria in Africa. Did a lot of more focused on public health aspect of it. So ended up graduating Iowa State with 2 PhDs or a double major in entomology and toxicology in 2021. And then actually ended up in Minnesota, where I am now, working in public health entomology for the full-time job. I'll talk more about the guidance stuff later. But yeah, so now I am, I'll call myself a full-time entomologist now. So bugs and toxicology combine really well. And then obviously being able to carry through that love of fly fishing and entomology the whole way through kind of defined my life. And I've found a way to make a career out of bugs and fishing. So ended up doing pretty well, I guess.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So now that we've established that you're a professional entomologist with a PhD, I was hoping that you could help provide some more detail on the periodical cicada life cycle. I feel like it's pretty confusing to predators and to anglers alike. So first of all, do you know anything about their evolutionary strategy involved with kind of the different broods, the 13 and 17 year?
Yeah. So, I'll answer this question as best as I can, but, cicadas have been around. I think some of the earliest records of cicadas in the fossil record go back to like 47 million years ago. A lot of the insects are pretty unchanged. It tends to be a pretty popular thing. Once an insect works out, it doesn't tend to adapt that much. So they're pretty ancient in terms of, species. A lot of the fish that we fish for, changed over a lot more recently than that. So they've been around a really long time. When we look at the two broods, talked about like a 13 and 17 year, the different broods that are going to happen. It's kind of like a weird thing for nature to do that. If we think of most patterns or most cycles that you see, everything tends to be cyclical, like 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, tends to be like even numbers, or even consistent odds. Like cicadas 13 and 17 are two prime numbers, which is super rare in nature that something's on these odd, like prime number years. A lot of the prevailing theory on it is this had to do a lot more with like almost a defense mechanism. If we look at, some of the main predators that are going to be feeding on cicadas, like you'll see the videos go crazy this year. And every year the cicadas of like possums and skunks and like all these, mammals that we see every day, snakes and birds, a lot of these things, like they're going to feast on the cicadas just as well. And the life cycles of those are usually fairly short. I guess like 5 to 10 years, the majority of predators. So if you have this big emergence every 13 and 17 years, you can tend to miss, potential booms in predators, right? So if you have, population spike every 4 to 6 years or whatever for a predator, you can be on those cycles of 13 or 17 years and kind of hit on times when, there may not be as many predators focused. And so that's kind of the prevailing theory on it, is almost predator avoidance. As we said, they're really, really old species, they're really, really old insects. Like what the predators look like back then and the numbers that, may have possessed back then might give you a little bit of a better snapshot for why 13 and 17 years. I mean, we'll never know. I don't think many people were around back then to talk to, but that's kind of the major theory, is that it's kind of a predator evasion technique of, you can be at odd numbered years. You probably don't overlap with these big booms of predator species either. And then also just like the massive numbers that, we see. If 1% of them live to reproduce, you're going to be doing pretty well still. So, that's a pretty big tie into, the belief of why it's 13 years and 17 years and why there's so many at a time.
Great. And maybe for everyone listening, for a given brood, and again, this year we're talking about brood 14, which is a 17-year brood. Could you just talk about the general life cycle to give people kind of an understanding of the context of what they're seeing?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, everyone's pretty familiar with, my wife can't stand them. One of our early dates, and we were still dating, we met in Iowa, and I kind of planned a trip to come back to, the Knoxville area, I think maybe like a year into dating, and was trying to tell her on why this was going to be such a cool thing. And she loves being outside, hates bugs. So, tough date idea, but and we did our best. We tried to make it work, but she stayed inside a lot for that one. So we're all really familiar with the adults that are going on, every 17 years. So that's something everyone's pretty familiar with, but what people usually don't associate with is, those bugs are older than most of your kids. People that I was fishing around have got young kids. These things are twice the age of kids usually. So they're either 13 or 17 years old by the time they're even emerging. So we all try to time the emergence depending on where it is, in the South or in the Midwest. So like as Matt talked about, it's usually over kind of like a week span when it starts. Some of the more exact numbers on it that I can kind of give you is, we're looking for soil temps, and that's soil about 8 inches below the surface. So some people can get really hardcore in this and get like a big meat thermometer and stick it down there and try to get 8 inches deep and get a little bit more exact. I never got that well into it, but people do. So we're looking for about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 inches below the surface. So that's kind of the trigger for that life cycle. So those nymphs, we'll call them, I've been underground for either 13 or 17 years. And they don't move a ton, as we'll talk a little bit about more later. The whole point, when they're really young, they're feeding on xylem. So kind of think of it as like the sap from grass or trees underground. Once that nymph gets a little bit bigger, they kind of shift over into more like woody plants, bushes, trees, that kind of thing. But once that soil hits 64, they're going to start emerging. What you're going to probably start seeing now, and maybe already seeing, people posting these pictures of things that look like little like turrets off of a cannon or a tank coming up. So we call those turrets. That's almost kind of like the century point. So the first nymphs will build those turrets and kind of almost check things out for a little bit. As they ascend, you'll start seeing that, the push coming up out of the ground. And that's usually kind of the start. You'll see those a couple days, and a few days later, you get the mass emergences happening. Once they emerge, the nymph is going to try to crawl up the first vertical structure you find. Everyone usually associates it with trees, these bigger trees, and that's, for the most part what it is. You'll see some really funny pictures of like people that have built, like mailboxes close to trees, and they'll climb the first vertical structure they can find. It's kind of part of the life cycle. So if it's a mailbox, if it's your car tires, whatever can get them higher, quicker, that's what they're going to climb up. Most of them, you've seen those cool videos and like hear the sounds. So you get the biggest numbers emerging at night. Some will come throughout the day too. That's why you tend to see like a ton of them on the trees every morning during this is happening. So they'll climb up the tree and start the whole emergence process. So these are an incomplete life cycle. So we think of most things of trout fishing or underwater bugs. We talk about like the pupal stage, like we're talking midges and crane flies and things. There's a pupal stage. So cicadas don't have that. So it's called hemimetabolous or incomplete life cycle. So they're going to basically be nymphs the whole way until there's an adult. There's really no like middle point to it. So you're going to see that on the trees. They do this really creepy thing that looks like a scene out of Tremors, where they climb up and they kind of flip backwards, kind of use gravity to help pull them out of that exoskeleton. And that's what you'll see kind of left on the trees as they climb up. Matt talked a lot about it, so I'm going to spend a ton of time on the next portion of it. But once they're out of that nymphal case and they're more in that adult form, it takes a while for that adult to be functional. And that's, we talk a lot about like the lag in this hatch, that, teneral period that Matt talked about. That can take like a few days, up to like 4 to 6 days. So what's happening there? When they emerge, they're pretty gummy. There's not much development yet. They don't have that typical like rigidity that we associate with insects. So it takes them a few days to get that, hardened up to make the wings viable. They've got to get venation to the wings so they can carry their, hemolymph and things. It's going to actually like push the wings. Takes a while for the muscles to get functional. So at that time, that's when you see a lot of the birds and stuff taking them off because they're pretty vulnerable at that time. That's another theory of why they hatch at night. The most part, they're the most vulnerable when they're first emerging. So if there's less predators at night, they can get away from that. And that's the part we normally see. Then, after a week or so, the males start calling to the females. That's, the drones that we typically associate with them. That's a really cool process of how they're doing it. They have these like certain sound organs on the sides called tymbals. Almost sounds just like cymbal with a T. Pretty similar to they can vibrate those, and that's what produces that sound. And the females will hear that. They'll fly off and mate. After that, the female will lay the eggs actually in the same tree, usually that they climb. They don't fly a ton, usually about the max range of an adult's a half a mile. We'll talk about that, more when talking about scouting for this, but they'll come back and lay the eggs in kind of the outermost like twigs and branches. And usually about 6 to 8 weeks later, those eggs will hatch and the larvae will either crawl down or fall down to the ground, the nymphs in it. And then we'll kind of bury themselves and start the whole process over again. And, that whole life cycle, from the time of emergence to the time the next larvae or the next nymphs hit the ground, usually like 8 weeks, give or take a few, depending on your temperatures and weather. But that's a summary of everything that we're looking at here happening over the course of it. Like you guys talked about in your last podcast, it's crazy that, this whole thing that we're basing this whole phenomena of that people have traveled and wrote books about is just kind of preying on the downfall of an insect that has no point being near water. It's kind of crazy to think about. We talk about salmon flies and sulfurs and BWOs and everything. Those are supposed to be on the water. Like these aren't. So the whole hope is you're hoping for things to drown. So just whenever we're out chasing and just think about that a little bit. However you want to feel about that. It always struck me as a little bit odd that, the water is just kind of unhappy coincidence for the bugs and something that we hope for so much. So just weird to think about. Something else to kind of throw on there, the different species in each emergence. So we typically think of like the brood is all the same thing. I think, in Dave's book, it talks about there can be like 2 to 4 different species happening at once, which is really cool concept. So when you see them, a lot of them will be like different sizes. And some of those are just like people, but some of those are actually different species too. And each species will have a different like frequency of call. So like if you hear, the sounds like War of the Worlds going on, you can usually pick up like different frequencies, different sounds, and that's what that's from. So different species have different calls. So this call of one won't attract, the species of the other one. So kind of a cool thing that's going on the whole time we're doing the hatches as well.
That's super interesting. I thought I'd mention one or two things for our listeners. One, you mentioned meat thermometers, and mine is inadequate, and it's only 6 inches long. I learned that the hard way. And, and then also, with where we're at in the emergence this year, we've already received a number of reports that bugs have kind of hatched, and people are in various stages of listening for the males. So, yeah, that's kind of a real time update of where we're at right now. But given all of that, are there a few points that you'd really emphasize specifically to anglers that are interested in fishing the hatch?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing to look at is it's super predictable, right? So I mean, like Matt was talking about, you can predict these things, hundreds of years in advance. It's not going to change. But what I think maybe goes unnoticed is these bugs were, laid 17 years ago. So we think 17 years to the date, they're going to be in the same spots. And for the most part, they should be. But, climate change is a big deal. We've been getting a lot more storms. We've been getting a lot of, changes to things like that. So something to be like maybe consider is, are the places that you fished 17 years ago? Like I know I've talked to a lot of people that remember the last time they did it. So for this one, there's people 17 years ago that fished it in Tennessee and Kentucky and everything and remember it. But if things have changed pretty drastically since then, it can make a pretty big impact on it. So, for instance, last year, I fished the one at Currycon. I think it's probably the most northernmost brood emergence that we get. So it covered a lot of Wisconsin, a lot of Iowa, Illinois, kind of upper, I call it middle Midwest, like not quite up into Minnesota, unfortunately. But a few years ago in 2020, Iowa, I think parts of Illinois too, had the great derecho. I don't know if anyone remembered that in Tennessee, probably not. Basically an earthquake over the middle of Iowa, or a hurricane over the middle of Iowa. We had like 150 mile an hour wind gusts, straight line winds, and it tracked across the entire state, leveled a bunch of trees, leveled a bunch of forest, caused, millions and millions and millions of dollars of damage to the whole state. And so no one cares about the cicadas, but something we didn't probably really think a whole lot about until we were waiting on them to happen. And it was pretty widely known, like you could see almost where that storm tracked and completely miss the cicadas. So if you kill off the trees, you kill off a lot of that vegetation that's supporting those larger nymphs underground. They can try to switch over to grasses, but, can tend not to be the best situations. I mean, even if you had them 17 years ago, if there's been pretty drastic changes, or, for Tennessee, like unfortunately with all the flooding, North Carolina, if a lot of those woods got knocked down, that's probably going to impact those numbers for the next brood. So that's something to be considered. The other thing too, as we're all aware, there's a lot more people living everywhere now. There's been a lot more development. So we try to find places that have, older stands of trees. So older meaning obviously 13 or 17 years old. So, a lot of, I got a lot of questions in Iowa when I was going around talking, the Midwest, that, oh, there's this pond behind my house and the new development outside of Des Moines. They're going to be there, right? And, probably not. The trees you planted that are 5 years old weren't there before to support anything. So a lot of this stuff is, we're talking about the research that you're doing, and Matt talked a lot about it too, of, being able to find those places that have older trees, have, old growth forest. People have asked, can you fish them in urban settings? Probably not, right? Because it's so developed. And, that's not as important to me that I've seen over the years. I mean, last year, I told you we fished the one. I did most of it in Wisconsin, but also did a little bit in Illinois. And we were fishing bass on a lake like a mile outside of O'Hare. One of the biggest airports in the country. That's cicadas buzzing all around it. So, the urban development doesn't really mess with them as long as they leave some trees. So like a lot of the Midwest has these like park preserves that, will be these little islands of trees in the middle of big cities. And all that stuff was still good. So it comes down to a lot more about kind of knowing at least kind of that middle range history of, how things have been for the last 10 or 20 years, and, trying to avoid those places that, unfortunately have got pretty decimated by, natural disasters since then. So that can throw it off, a ton too. And then the other thing, like we talked a little bit about from the entomology side of thing, when you're looking for places, when I was giving talks about it last year for the Midwestern broods, people were like, yeah, I've got this lake, it's full of carp. man, there's carp everywhere, big catfish, everything's going to be eaten up. But, the closest woods are 2 miles away. So the wind will blow them over, right? And, no, tends to not be the case. So I tell people you want to shoot for ones that are right on the water, preferably old ones. If there's some, I tend to use that half a mile as kind of the point of that's probably about as far as the crazy ones are going to go. The majority of these are going to be the tree they grew up on, or maybe a couple trees over is about as far as they're going to need to go. Once they mate, they don't really need to fly for any other reason. So once they find what they're looking for, and if you're familiar with this, it's, they're not too picky. There's a lot of fish in the sea for them to pick, so they don't fly too far. So you want to be finding those trees that are, pretty close to the water, not too far out. And the more overhang you can get, the better. As we talked about, they're chunky little insects. Not the best for aerodynamics. So they get tired pretty quick. So when they're flying over water, they tend to look for those kind of outstretched branches to kind of get into safety. So those places that have, overhangs tend to be what I focus on first when you're looking for more, you want the resting spots that are pretty easy for them to accidentally drop and drown, which you'll see a ton. So yeah, you're looking for kind of old woods with hopefully some overhangs near water is the perfect situation. But you can find components of that. You can still be pretty successful.
Great. Well, that's really helpful. That's really interesting too. So when it comes to identifying kind of where to find bugs in a given year, how would you go about that process? And maybe can you broadly describe where people can expect to find them in 2025?
Yeah, so we talked about Brood 14, the one that's happening this year. Kins seems like everyone's asking about Tennessee because I grew up in how good it's going to be there. Tennessee's going to be getting it, but it seems like the major part of this is like Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, I think maybe some in Indiana as well. But it seems like that Kentucky and Ohio are the main one. Kind of the epicenter of it, it seems like, if you draw a middle point and the whole thing is kind of around that Cincinnati, Ohio area. A lot of rivers in there, a lot of lakes around there too, full of carp. So I would anticipate those guys, Cincinnati are about to get hammered pretty well with bugs and carp for a little bit. Doesn't seem like there's as much, in the immediate Tri-Cities area. Maybe further west would be a better option to go. But yeah, if you got the time, that seems to be where it's going to be thickest at this year. I talked to some guys down in Ohio, and they haven't seen a ton of bugs yet, but starting to see some coming out, I guess. So we're good time to be doing this. Probably a couple weeks out from the peak of it. Still, it's May 15th as we record this, so hopefully by the end of May, people are swimming in carp.
Cool. And as people are kind of formulating their own searches, what are some resources you'd recommend checking out?
Yes, and I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the kind of what's became to be like the Cicada Bible around these parts, all across the world. The Cicada Madness book from Zelensky, obviously a really great place to start.
Mm-hmm.
As you talked about, it's a great read, not super intimidating to read. So if you're not as much of a bug nerd as a lot of us are that's doing this, a lot of really good pictures, a lot of really cool fly tying stuff in there too. So even if you're not as into the hardcore information, you just want to get a good glance for it and kind of get a summary, you can pick and choose through there or read it cover to cover like I'm sure all of us have done. I'm looking at the copy on my desk right now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's around there. So that's a really good place to start. In addition to that one, there's a lot of good online resources, and I'll try to add some new ones that maybe you didn't cover in the last one. Cicada Safari is a pretty cool one. Obviously, that's going to be the real-time factor. This is really cool, especially when you have a brood that spans pretty far north to south. Like when we had it last year, I could see it start in Indiana, kind of work its way further north up into Wisconsin. So it's cool to watch kind of that wave starting. And these real-time apps give you a lot, like Cicada Safari. Another really good one, I think you guys may have mentioned it, is the UConn, so University of Connecticut has a program called the Cicada Project that does a lot of this like citizen scientist, type of research where it's basically like if you see them, if you see something, say something, but hopefully a little bit more fun than the normal one. So you see that out here a lot. So that's a really good one. The other one that I feel is pretty overlooked, and I will lead with this about this. You got to sort through these. But there's a lot of pretty good stuff on Facebook too. So there's a group last year. It was called Cicadas 2024. I did check before this podcast, and it's now Cicadas 2025. So that was updated. I don't know how many fishermen are in that group, but we don't really care because that's going to be a lot of people posting pictures of when they see bugs, how far along we are. I looked on there before we started, and you definitely started to see that get posted. So I would jump in that group if it's something you're considering traveling for to fish. You could ask some really interesting questions too on there to people that, you know, they think are weird every time. But how far is this from this so and so river? I did that a lot last year. If you're going to an area you're not familiar with, you can make up a cool story about how you really want to get some pictures of cicadas in the water, and people will tell you exactly where to go. So, that helps a lot. Feign the photography aspect, and you can get some great comments that'll literally lead you right to it. So Facebook's a really cool place to start. I would do that. All those are good. The books, those different websites, and the Facebook groups were a ton more informative than I anticipated them being. So, and then obviously social media is pretty big in fishing, if you guys haven't heard. So in a couple of weeks, you're going to start seeing pictures of everyone catching them, and some people will hide it better than others, but you'll know when it's going on. So.
I like that. I like the idea of catfishing people for cicada spots.
Oh, for sure. I love taking pictures of bugs on the water. I used that one a ton last year. So it's a great place to start. We have to become photography nerds this time of year to get you a little more information.
That's awesome. So I know cicadas can be like hyper localized, and when you're fishing the hatch, are you staying pretty static or are you moving around, and how do you kind of adapt to what you see on the water?
Yeah, so good question. So I guess that's a tougher answer. So I mean, for my instances, I don't live around cicadas much anymore. Unfortunately, Minnesota I don't think we get any broods. Maybe in the very southern part we may get, a hit or miss one here or there, or, one that flew a little bit further on the wind or something, but we don't get a ton of them. So for me to do it, I've usually coming back south, last year was my close one. And, my wife told me I was crazy. I got up at 3 and drove like 4 hours, fished for 10 hours and drove back that night. That was kind of my cicada program. So I was driving like 10 hours a day to do it, because working in the day, and it was great fun. But nowadays, if I'm coming back to Tennessee, I don't really travel a ton. So I'll kind of do a lot of research on the end. I tell people, like my wife, Emily, she could probably have like an honorary doctorate in entomology by now, just of how many times I call people and talked about cicadas over the years to plan trips and figure out where we're going to go. But I usually do a lot of work on the early end. So hopefully not miss too bad. I've thought they were going to be great in East Tennessee and ended up in Knoxville a few times and closer down to Nashville in previous ones. So I definitely missed it a few times and had to adjust, but for the most part, I'll try to get a lake. That's something else I wanted to hit on too. We talked a lot about, Cicada Safari or whatever app you're going to use says, Sullivan County is loaded with them, but, Sullivan County might be, but that might be on one lake in Sullivan County. And even more specific to that, it might be one side of one lake in Sullivan County, and the other side of the lake hasn't sniffed a bug in, 17 years. So it's a lot more hit or miss, I think, than most people realize. When you see the map, it makes it almost look like it's going to be easy to find. And, that can sometimes be the case, but what I told people, and I don't think this is spot burning. Everyone knows the lake's down there, but, we started on fish one side of the lake and had tons of didn't have any bugs, kind of wondered what all the hype was about, made the run across to the other side of the lake and screaming bugs everywhere and carp up everywhere. So, I mean, once you get your lake figured out or your river figured out, I like to tell people, be as mobile as you need to be within that body of water, because there's a good chance half of it's going to be good and half of it's going to be bad. And then once you kind of find your spot, whenever we did the one, 2012 was the first one I did. Once we kind of found that spot, you didn't have to move a whole lot, throughout the emergence. So like, we were in the same similar cove, same couple coves for, 2 or 3 weeks. And it was, really consistent through that. So they can be super spotty, not even on a county level, but on a lake level as well. So, make sure you're, have the ability to be mobile, in an area. And typically once you find it, you can, zone in on that a little bit better. From what I've seen, temperature matters a lot. Those dry, warmer days typically make them fly a lot better. They're calling a lot more. And even like throughout the day, I think that people have talked about it a lot about, is this typical topwater, I call it mythology, because I never really had the whole thing about topwater only works in the morning and evenings. I usually tell people, that tends to be some of the slower times of the day for the cicadas. So, the middle of the day when it's the hottest and the driest tends to be when I have the best luck for it. So if you're not an early riser, you don't tend to miss too much for this one. If you are, I tend to tell people like pick where the sun hits first. If you're going to get out in the morning, they got to have their wings dry. People don't think about it. There's a ton of dew, settling on the wings. They can't fly as well. So that's got to be dried off. They need to be dry before they're going to really take flight for the day. So areas where the sun's going to hit first will be better on the lake early on. So that's something else to keep in mind.
That's awesome. That's super helpful. And I know we mentioned this before, but our whole goal with talking about this is really just to get more information out there on a pretty confusing topic. It's not a promotion to come to Bluff City, Tennessee to fish for periodical cicadas. So just to confirm specifically, if you were going to plan a periodical cicada trip this year, would you be targeting the South Holston and Watauga tailwaters?
There's a lot of really great stuff to do on the South Holston and Watauga tailwaters, but for this year, I would not be planning a cicada trip there. Go for it. Check out the trout fishing. A lot of fun stuff to do. Really good bass fishing too, which always had my heart. But yeah, definitely not cicadas. Make a stop by, get some pals for me. But maybe not think of cicadas.
Good.
That's
good.
There this year.
That's what I've been telling people too. And there will be some cicada opportunities within a reasonable drive of here if you're local.
Yeah.
If you're not local, come fish for big brown trout and smallmouth and everything. We've got great fisheries here, but don't come out and expect the Holston to be lined with cicadas. And having said all of that, it would be good to have one with you just in case. There's some weird straggler things that are kind of happening locally. And if you're on a specific corner of a specific body of water, it might come in handy, but don't plan your cicada trip this year to the South Holston or Watauga. Yeah. So I know you've fished multiple broods now, both in Tennessee and further north. And until recently, information, at least in the fly fishing world, has been pretty hard to come by, or targeted towards the fly fishing industry. So how did you really get into it?
Yeah. So, I think I feel like everyone in fly fishing has kind of I just kind of fell into something really cool moment. My first interaction with cicadas was definitely that. So it was my senior year of high school. So that would have been 2012. My parents got me, thank God for this one. My parents got me an old Ranger bass boat for like my high school graduation. It ran like half the time. And half the time happened to be the next day. So Watson's Marine, the fishing, boat dealership there in Bluff City. Aaron had told my dad, don't waste your time on this part of the lake. It's all carp eating the locusts. And they're not locusts, so just getting that out there, completely different. But I thought that was super cool. So my dad was still to this day a devout carp hater. It's one of the things that I'm not sure if I was switched to the hospital or not, but he tends to hate on the carp a little bit. So I had to talk him into wanting to try it, and had been fly fishing for a few years at that point, but was far from good. We put the boat in the water, went to the first cove, and saw the first like free swimming carp, like way off the bank. Made one of the worst casts in fly fishing history. And then I had read about carp and how picky they are, how tough they are to catch, and was trying to lead the fish by 10 feet or so. Was like 20 feet behind it, which was pretty par for the course back then. And fish spun around, turned on a dime, came over and just inhaled possibly the worst tide fly you've ever seen. I took one little sheet of black foam and bucktail and like tied a knot in the foam around the bucktail. It was really impressive. No legs, nothing. And, that was like one of like 60 fish we caught that day on that fly. So, I look at all these flies nowadays and like, man, that's a crazy well-tied fly. And then I look back at that picture and it's like, yeah. Does it really matter that much? Yeah. So that was the first one I caught. And that set off like 2 weeks of us doing that pretty much every day. I was able to get my dad to catch a few of them back then. And, he was catching them on the good old Zara spook. topwater bait. So even if you're not a fly fisherman at all, you can be super successful with this stuff too. So that's that's how I got into it and fell in love with it in that one. And then there was a few while I was in grad school that I came back for, kind of across the state and up into Virginia a little bit. Then last year we fished the big one in Wisconsin. That was a pretty cool one too. Do it a little bit closer to kind of my new home now, so that was a pretty special thing to kind of be able to do that again. But yeah, kind of fell into it by happened to have a boat at the right time and showed up and saw how fun it was. So
That's awesome.
much about it beforehand, but yeah, it's pretty cool first start.
Cool. And I know that you'd mentioned that kind of early on, there were a few people who kind of helped you get introduced to it and help you along.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mean, some of the early ones we talked about, I talked a lot about getting me into fly fishing. Patrick and Troy were definitely, them and Rod were definitely my three that kind of really started me off. But when I got more into cicada stuff and started doing a lot more travel, talked quite a bit with Blaine. You mentioned him on the last podcast about, all the materials. And I met him he used to do a fly tying class of mountain sports every year. I was supposed to be working those and helping people out and teaching them how to tie, helping them, and Blaine was talking through them. And kind of hard for me to do that one because I was probably the biggest fan of it that was in the room every single time. So that was really cool to kind of see the patterns develop on his son. He helped me a lot of kind of helping me dial in on places and a lot on like the presentations and things. So yeah, he was a pretty big, I still consider him a pretty big mentor, and I use a lot of his, bait fish stuff now with the changer platforms and stuff like that. But I feel like kind of everyone has their niche into fly fishing tends to have those people, lucky enough to have some good ones. Blaine helped me a lot early on in the cicadas too, but yeah, it's really cool and kind of get to use all that same stuff that works in Tennessee cicadas, fooled them just as well in Wisconsin too. So it's really cool to be able to take that knowledge from people and kind of apply it to your own fisheries too. That's always a really good time for me.
Well, kind of pulling this around full circle, Blaine is scheduled to come and do a tying class for us at Tailwaters on June 7th. So maybe he can help foster the next generation of Caleb's.
I don't know if the world's ready for that enough. Let's try.
Nice. Well, for someone who's new to fishing the periodical cicada emergence, can you just describe some of the really cool things that you've seen to kind of give people that sense of excitement that maybe they should have when they're thinking about this?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, I feel like certain words get used in fly fishing all the time, but oh man, we had this epic bite today. And you hear the word like phenomenon get thrown around a bunch. Red fishing today in Louisiana was phenomenal. It's phenomenon. You got to see it. And, this that may be true, but like this actually is of the chances of this actually happening and having the overlap of a bug being where it's not really supposed to be. That's a pretty wild thing. So what I find that it does a lot, especially to like the hardcore guys out there listening to this that spend a lot of time on the water and know their fisheries super well inside and out, you're probably going to see fish that live there that you've probably never even seen before. So like what we talked about, in Wisconsin, a good friend of mine, Luke, he's a guide here in Wisconsin. We fished on a body of water that typically produces 5 to 8 pound fish consistently, and there's a lot of them. I think the smallest fish we threw a cicada at was like 15 pounds plus. So it's this weird concept of fish that may normally not present themselves to you and be targetable. There's a bunch of T-bone steaks landing on the water every 10 seconds. So if you have a fish that maybe bottom feeding, or maybe it's doing something weird that it's not in your typical spots, that fish might show up a bunch. Fishing the East Tennessee lakes, I didn't realize how many grass carp were in those lakes until cicada showed up. You start seeing a bunch of those. We talk so much about the carp fishing is so incredible. When you're in these really cool multi-species areas, and if the people that are listening to this that are going to be traveling to Ohio, where they have a lot of, this is the toughest thing for me now because Tennessee calls them hybrids, Iowa calls them wipers. There's sunshine bass in Florida, whatever you call the white bass striper hybrids wherever you are. Those things will crush them too. We've seen hybrids eating them in Tennessee. We've seen stripers eat them in Tennessee. Catfish, grass carp, bass, bluegills. No one ever really talks about the normal topwater stuff during all this. It takes you got a constant conveyor belt of food coming for a few weeks. So it tends to, you can almost hit that like factory reset button on a lot of these fish. And, I think we're going to talk about it later too, but that's, people tend to associate carp with, the more flat style bone fishing. And man, it's hard. Like even in a place that has a lot of fish, they're spooky, they're wary. You've light tippets and small flies and perfect presentations, and like that couldn't be further from the truth. So I mean, if you ever really wanted to do the carp thing, this is your best chance, and you'll get it again in 13 or 17 years. So try not to miss this one if it's something you're really into, but it can show you a whole different realm of the fishery that you think you're an expert on, and you might be, but you're probably going to see things and different fish in a different size class of fish. So even if you're not traveling, even if this is happening right where you are, and you think the biggest carp in your lake, I bet you don't, and you'll probably see it when you see these bugs out. So that's a really cool thing for me every year. Every time I've gotten to do it is kind of relearning a fishery and seeing, I thought there were 10-pound carp in here. There's a 30-pound one in here. It shows you a whole different class of fish, and kind of it's really cool. Us as fly fishermen, we really love to see the whole visual aspect of it, and that's true. But the even cooler thing we like to see is fish almost acting how they're not supposed to act. When we have shad kills below the dams and stuff, it kind of flips that switch a little bit and takes them out of that super wary mode. And you're taking arguably one of the smarter fish and carp. About, if you look into the physiology of carp and like comparison of their brain size to their body size, they're one of the like higher ratios of that, which if you want to look at how that means in intelligence of fish, that's probably a conversation for another day. But they're smart, and it feels like they get a little bit dumber for this time period. So it's a really good opportunity to really see some cool stuff, and something that really is kind of like a biological phenomenon that a lot of people overlook. So a lot of really cool stuff happened, a lot of really different stuff that you've probably never seen before
Awesome.
during it.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit more in detail about some of the stuff you've learned fishing the hatch on the water. And so, you talked a little bit about the species that you've seen, but specifically, kind of what have you targeted, and how does their behavior change based on that species?
Yeah, so I think obviously the big one that's going to get beat to death over the next few weeks, but that's fine, is going to be like the carp. So common carp is definitely what I go for. I'm a big carp fisherman up here. I do the like flat style fishing all the time for them. The spot and stock, drag and drop stuff. That's something I'm really into. So common carp are the biggest thing I go for. Another pretty common one, like, Matt talked about, grass carp seem to change quite a bit. And I agree with everything he said too about the common carps tend to be in like little small, like almost like wolf packs hunting them down. The grass carp, I always say, are kind of like late cows. They're just got to sit there in one area and kind of just graze along and grab all the bugs that come down. The really cool thing that I didn't really think about fly fishing much at all is like the channel cats, or if you got blue cats. I don't know if flatheads eat them or not. I've never really fished a lot of places that have those. But, you can get a lot of channels up. They tend to be the most aggressive catfish on this. And it's a funny visual, kind of like what Matt was talking about with the carp having to come up. When you look in a cove and you just see like 100 pairs of whiskers sticking out of the water, it's a weird thing to see. Then obviously like the bass and panfish, that's a, I feel like they don't get talked about much because they're usually so available on top water. So I feel like they're kind of like the ignored group, but they eat them too. But I think there's a lot cooler options going on right now with that. And then the oddball stuff, like we talked about the wipers and the stripers. I know if you're down in some of the other TVA lakes, they get a lot of like freshwater drum. They'll come up and eat them too. So it's most things will eat them. It's just the consistency of it, and I tend to base everything around the carp, and then anything else that happens is a really cool bonus after that.
Interesting. And one thing that I think is kind of a misconception, given what you see on Instagram, is just when certain species are going to be on cicadas. And so just to reiterate a little bit, in your experience, is there a big carp waiting to take the first cicada that lands on the water?
Not from my experience. So that's not what I've seen at all. So like try to tell people is, just because you see bugs doesn't mean there's going to be fish eating them yet. And I tend to kind of, when I'm doing it, and I use the bluegills and panfish, brim, whatever you want to call them, wherever you are. Moving to a different part of the country, you have to learn a whole new set of names for things. But, the bluegills, as I always call them, tend to key in on it first. This is what I've always seen. We talked a little bit about it on the phone before. A lot of times early in the hatch, you'll have, 50 bugs floating over top of, a pair of carp that are tailing below them, and they could care less. So, that's something that's going to happen for a while. From what I've seen, usually the bluegills get involved first. You get these big bugs hitting the water, and a bluegill probably can't eat the whole thing, so they'll be up there tearing them apart, kind of making a ruckus, and then carp looks up and sees a bug and decides, hey, maybe I'll take a shot at that. Then it happens over and over again. And I always think the bluegills are kind of like the messengers to the carp. Especially in the Midwest that I've seen so far, the bluegills usually started off. The catfish up here were kind of the second thing. I think that's pretty similar, back in Tennessee too, in the South. Catfish tend to get on it pretty quick, and then once the carp get on it, obviously they're going to stay on it for a while too. But that's not usually like an instant thing. I've tried to tell people you're going to see the first bugs, and people are going to go running out, and you don't hear them yet, and then you're going to hear them, and then you're going to go running out, and they're in the water, and there's no fish eating them. So then people get upset, and then maybe like a week after that, it gets really good. So I think it's just like tempering expectations of like how the timing goes. It's not as intuitive as you would think. The majority of carp you're going to be seeing, they probably weren't around the last time there were cicadas. So for a lot of these fish, it's probably the first time they've ever seen one. So it takes a while to get that switch figured out that, hey, the food's coming from above, and it's not damselfly, nymphs, and crawdads anymore. We're going to go eat these bugs on top. So I like to usually tell people early on it can be pretty slow. You might find a carp or two that, key into it within the first week, but then, you got about 2 or 3 weeks of, really consistent fishing. And then after that 2 to 3 weeks, it'll start declining for about a week or so. And then something that I always tell people, if you miss it and you're way late to it, and, it's a week after the bugs have stopped, fish aren't stupid. I think they can remember it a little bit. So if there's not a ton of bugs on the water and you still have them around, you still have your flies, you can still be successful for a little bit afterwards. Like some of those fish are still going to be up shallow, cruising, looking for them. They're not coming, but then they might think there's a few left. So I tell people usually it's about a month of, consistent, slow to consistent fishing, with those, 2 to 3 weeks in the middle being, usually pretty incredible. But, it's definitely not an instant thing once the bugs show up. It's not even an instant thing once they get the water in, most cases.
That's a really interesting point. I had never really thought that it was going to be the first time that a specific fish had probably seen that happen. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So what type of gear are you typically using when you're fishing these hatches?
Yeah, so heavy stuff. Your average, depending on your water, they're big fish. They're probably going to be the hardest fighting fish you've ever caught. If you're, freshwater, stripers would probably take the cake. But, most people may be the hardest fighting fish they've caught. I prefer the 8-weight rods for the most cases. Just they're a bigger fly, bigger than our typical stuff we're going to be throwing for trout and things like that. I like the bigger rod. I like to have a little bit more backbone to, fight the fish too. 7 weights is like the lightest end, but usually 8s. If you're into trying something new, or maybe if you're into some of the old school stuff, I think the Cicada hatch is like tailor-made for glass rods. You can beat the crap out of a glass rod. It's probably going to happen a lot when you're cicada fishing. You can put a lot more heat on the fish with a glass rod. They're fine. All fly rods are pretty flexible. The glass takes it to a whole nother level. You can almost get the parabolic bend like all the way down into the cork, and you can put a lot of heat on those fish, get them in quicker, and you can get back to catching the next one quicker too. So I really love the the glass rods for them. Normally not a huge fan of glass because you're casting all day and blind casting. They're heavy, but for these guys, when you're seeing your fish, you can almost get to pick out the fish you want. I think it's perfect for glass. Reels, people ask me all the time what kind of reels to buy. I usually tell them like whatever you can afford. Not too different for this one, but your drag is going to get tested a lot more than they would be, say, your typical trout or bass fishing. So something with a smooth drag. I won't give you names of reels or anything like that, but something that's got a decent drag to it, because you will. Good chance you'll probably see your backing for the first time fishing for these guys, so that's always really fun. If you're looking for the lines, Rio, SA, whatever your favorite is, I use pretty similar stuff that I would use bass fishing. Like the Titan taper lines, or like your typical like bass bug lines, tend to be a little heavier weighted. So if you're an 8-weight rod, an 8-weight bass bug line's probably closer to like an 8.5 taper. That'll help flip over those bigger flies a little bit easier. So something warm water too. Like Matt said, stick away from the cold stuff. It's going to be warm. You don't want to get that line getting gummy and sticky on you. So warm water line, your typical bass papers will be fine. You don't need a special carp line or anything. I remember there's a time when people had that. So don't know if that's been around anymore. For leader, you don't need something super long for most cases. I try to get like 6 to 7 feet out of mine. I feel like a lot of people are saying this now too. It's a pretty standard like bass leader that you're going to be using. If you make your own, great. If you buy the pre-made ones, you want to end it with like 16-pound test mono or 12-pound mono or nylon. I build all my own for it. So I go 40, 30, 20, 12, or 16 at the end, 16 or 12 for the end. And I'll usually do like 1.5 feet, 2 foot at each. Get it tapered down to that 12 or 16 at the fines. But yeah, no light tip if needed. Knock the South Olsen special 14-foot leaders for this. So shorten them up, get them a lot thicker. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm glad I won't be fishing a 15-foot leader. So in your experience, are you primarily fishing lakes or are you fishing rivers as well? And how do your tactics differ between the two?
Yeah, I have probably done a little bit of it all. Tennessee did mostly lakes, I'll say. Virginia, mostly lakes. Last year when it was further north, we stuck to a lot more rivers. Lakes, when we kind of talk through what you're going to be looking for, areas that, the cicadas are looking for, resting sites, those overhanging limbs, trees near the water. It's pretty easy to tell usually. Like you're going to be seeing the fish for the most part. They'll be up pretty high in the water column looking for them. So not a super hard thing on the lakes, I guess, when you find them. Rivers, I found I thought it was a little bit more fun because you're fighting river fish. They're even stronger than they already are. So I like that a lot. And I'm also definitely a river rat to the core. So I like that a little bit more than the lakes probably. What I did see is like the spread in the lakes tends to be a lot more, meaning like there's a lot more fish spread out over a lot larger area. Rivers, it seemed to be pretty consistent where, areas that I may not typically fish, we'll talk about my like guiding stuff when I'm fishing for bass and things. I really look for those riffly water, current seams, your typical like holding, ambush areas for predator fish. And for this, it seems like those areas, even if you're bass fishing it, for you guys that are going to be doing that this year, don't seem to be as great. Think of it like a conveyor belt that drops all the bugs off in one place. So from what I've seen in rivers, you get a pretty big congregation of fish anywhere in those big eddy lines or anywhere that's, a back channel off of a, pretty fast flowing riffle. So you almost got to change your thinking a little bit of they're not really looking to ambush anymore. They're just looking for the areas where there's going to be the mass amount of fish and have them expend the littlest amount of energy. So you get a lot more in those slack water areas. You get a lot more in like eddy lines of, recirculators that they bring a bunch of bugs to one place. So when you're fishing rivers, like if you got on your mind, oh, this river is going to be awesome. I catch fish off that current edge all the time. It may be a little bit different when the cicadas. So don't go to the place assuming it's going to be in the exact same places. Those fish will move pretty well to, locate those bigger groups of fish.
Interesting. And what are some of the tactics that you've kind of picked up on that may not be super obvious to people that have kind of worked or bailed you out of some situations?
We'll talk a little bit about later too, but about how, the good thing about this is you can get a lot of beginners into it. It really kind of cuts the learning curve of carp fishing, gives someone, a different experience that's not trout or bass, just someone maybe the more standard species. Which is really nice if you're new to fly fishing, you haven't got your perfect presentation, tight loops with the fly landing softly. Even when I do it, you want to, I tell people like, make it smack. So whenever you throw it out there, I want to get a pretty loud sound. So, if you can, bring your loops a little bit closer to the water and kind of get that really good smack when it hits the water. So from what I've seen, delicate doesn't really have a place in cicada fishing. someone's going to write in and tell you like, yeah, that's wrong. And mine are super sensitive and great. But most of the time that's not the case. So I'll tell people, almost kind of forget what you know about the delicate presentation and kind of lean heavy the opposite. You can take a fish that, is looking in a completely different direction. And kind of like I told you about my first one, I made a terrible cast and was 10 feet behind it. And it was probably a terrible cast and super loud and smacky, and it, flipped around and came and eaten it. So a lot of this is, trying to draw attention to your bug. There's a good chance there's 200 other ones that are real in the same area you're fishing. So kind of make yours stand out and then smack it down. So I think that fishing a plop helps a lot. The other really cool thing, I was glad Matt talked about it because I was hoping I could talk about this aspect of it. Fish with these subterminal, like downward facing mouths. It's hilarious to watch them try to eat a cicada because they got to get their whole head above it. And it looks like they're really cool redfish videos, but even weirder. So that's obviously part of a problem for it. And they can do it. They'll figure it out. But what I found is if you fish, I've always called it like drowned cicada patterns. So, if you have a fly that's not floating a ton or something like that, and it's sinking on you or something like that, or what if you somehow didn't know this was happening, you can fish a fly subsurface too. Like they don't float forever. They're not buoyant. So eventually they're going to start sinking. And, once the fly is under the surface and a lot more on their level, they can eat it a little bit better. So, a lot of that drowning cicadas is pretty cool. You can almost streamer fish for them. You can take one or take like a black and orange woolly bugger, or, anything that's got that dark color, put it in front of one's face and strip it. And, they're not too picky this time. So they'll oftentimes chase that, and you can kind of get a whole different component to it. We all love seeing them come up and eat them on top, but if they're not as willing that day, or if it's early in the day and they're not uprising as hard, you can be pretty successful with that, like sinking fly, drowned cicada impersonation too.
Nice. Well, let's talk flies. You're an entomologist and a commercial tyer. So what do you look for in a good cicada fly?
Yeah, I found is the hook. So the hook is going to be really, really important for this. Again, say an average is a 10-pound fish. Obviously, there's going to be a lot bigger ones out there. And not only are they bigger fish, you're going to be fishing a heavier tippet. So the breaking point's going to get exposed pretty quick. You'll see a lot of, commercially available flies that are, tied on like a light wire trout hook. We think of cicada fishing as this cool, like warm water thing because it is, but, there's annuals every year and trout eat them all over the place too. So you can see cicadas tied on pretty light wire hooks, and that ends in heartbreak the majority of the time on these big fish. So I think the first thing you're going to look at is make something that's got a good hook. People are going to tie, so I'll tell you what I do. So I do Gamakatsu, or like the ARX, RX, however you want to pronounce it. Gamakatsu kind of has a thing, once you start getting the smaller sizes, it gets a little wiry and thin. So size 4 and up, I'll use the Gamakatsu, like the Cicadas, the traditional stinger hook. I should probably own stock in Gamakatsu by now with how many of those hooks I've tied on. So 4 and up, I think Gamakatsu is a really good choice. Some of the smaller species, tend to be like a size like 6, maybe even down to an 8. You can find some really cool like ARX hooks, like I think it's the SA280, like the minnow model. The same hook that everyone's tying like changers on, the front hook on a changer. That's a really good cicada hook too. It's a heavy wire. People are going to say, like, doesn't it sink? You're going to put a ton of foam on there so it can kind of offset that heavier, thicker wire, and you won't bend them out. So those are my 2 favorite hook options for cicadas. Like Matt said, you can do the cork or the foam. I like the foam. It's personal preference. You can tie them a lot quicker. Get through them, floats pretty good. The other thing, and Matt talked about it, I wanted to hit on a little bit more, is the whole wing idea. So if you're doing this and you want to really get good at this, before you even start casting or tying, watch a few that sit on the water and tell me how many have the wings like sticking straight up in the air. Probably none of them. So whenever they drown, they spread their wings. It's kind of the last ditch effort, and you don't see anything sticking up on top. You almost don't even see them, when they're sitting on the water. So like the ones you guys have down there, if you put them in the water, you're going to be able to see it, but the majority of the fly is going to be sitting kind of, we talk about like the surface film a lot for trout fishing, like our midge emergers or mayfly emergers. And it's kind of what I'm trying to do with this too. The majority of the cicada is underwater when it's floating. you're only kind of seeing a little bit of the top, and the majority of the fly is underwater. So that's what I'm trying to mimic out of the flies is you don't want something that's sitting up super high. It makes it hard for the carp to get up and get its mouth around it. And your hookup ratio is going to be a lot lower. So, as cool as those flies with the big like deer hair wings and like the spun deer hair and everything look, from my experience, they look really cool and they'll still catch fish, but I like the ones that sit a lot lower in the water, with a lot more like flat wings, if that makes any sense. So we use a lot of like EP fiber for a wing, or you can use a bunch of different stuff. I like the EP a lot. MSC makes a product called like Widow's Web, I think is what it's called. They even carry it in the shop, John. That's a really cool wing material too, or like the poly post material, the same stuff you're going to use for like your parachutes. That makes a really cool wing material, and it's one that splays out and then it hits the water and doesn't stand straight up. And then you want, a pretty thick body, so you don't want a really skinny, body on your fly either. So kind of thick bodied, flat wings. People ask me all the time, you're an entomologist, why do your flies only have 4 legs? But it's fine. I promise you they won't count. So that's another component to it. Realistic and impressionistic is, it gets talked about so much in fly tying, and it's the fun part about tying. Everyone's right. So that's just kind of some of the things I look for. Stiff hook, thick body, a flat wing that doesn't stick up, and you want it to ride pretty low as kind of my 4 main points I'm looking for.
Awesome. So more specifically, let's talk about some of your patterns. We're carrying 2 of them in the shop and have a limited number available online. Can you describe those to our listeners?
When Dave put out the book, I was like, if that's interesting. It's I think everyone's been doing the cicada stuff for so long, and there's certain, those patterns like Chernobyl ants, the old like Whitlock's beetle and everything. I think fly tying is so cool is you can see so many components from like other people's flies everywhere. The one I was tying was just kind of the segmented body, really similar to like Dave's 17-year itch fly that he put in the book. I've copied that fly and caught tons of fish on them too. The one you guys have was the one that I've kind of been fishing for the last 3 or 4 different emergences. So I've done. So it's, again, there's going to be less similarities in the fly. So I don't claim to have came up with any fly or anything like that, but it's kind of the thicker double layer. The ones you guys have, I use like 3mm foam on the back, 2mm foam on the belly, and it's 2 pieces tied together, kind of segment it like the body. And then it's got the wings I use. That's got the Widow's Web wing material and kind of that orange cider. That's the problem. I don't think it's a problem, but when you tie the flies like that, they're kind of still a little bit lower in the water. I like to add that cider, the orange that you guys have on there. So that's a pretty big one. And then the other one you guys have is, I've heard a lot when I was fishing with a lot of new people. It's a heavy fly. It's a pretty wind resistant fly. It's kind of tough for I always try to get out new people when we do the cicadas. And so you guys have, I think, 75 or however you got left of the first one. And there's a couple dozen of the other one too. That's more of kind of a Chernobyl, a lot more, a little bit easier to cast, a little bit lighter. You can fish them, on a lighter rod if you want. But both pretty big producers for me over the years. But yeah, those are the 2 you guys have. So hopefully those bins are empty here in a few weeks.
Well, we'll link to some of those so people can take a look. Can you also describe some of your drowned cicada patterns?
It's not, I don't say it's exactly like a whole new fly. Maybe it's a different method for it. So, if you take those same flies that, you have a mine down there, whatever cicada flies people are going to fish, after a while, they're going to start not being as buoyant. Or if you strip them down, they'll almost act like a popper or something like that. You can get them underwater and strip them before they float back up. You can do it like that. If you have the certain flies, you can just put like a little tiny split shot on there or something and get it to sit right below the surface. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. It's not, not as much of a different pattern. If you do want to tell your own pattern for it, if you look up the old like dubbing ant or something like that, where it's just like 2 bumps and like some soft, like a hackle spun in the middle of it. If you just take that and tie it even bigger, that can work pretty well too. If you want to ruin a fly that you bought, you can take it and just kind of cut some of the wings off of it, and that'll sink it down a little bit. Cut some of the foam off of it. Please don't do that to mine. Spend a lot of time flying. But if you have old flies or anything like that, or like I said earlier, it doesn't even need to we complicate it. It doesn't even have to be a cicada for the drown thing. You know, I watched my dad catch them on black crankbaits every year doing this. So I mean, they can be caught on a little bit of everything. So woolly butters work really well. You know, drowned cicadas, they're just, you know, foam that doesn't float as well anymore. If you got one that's pretty chewed up or torn up or something like that, and it's sinking, you know, maybe save that one and do this with it. So just a little bit of a different, you know, different way to do it.
Cool. Cool. Well, as an entomologist and a tyer, this has to be a pretty special event for you. Can you talk a little bit more about the enjoyment you get out of fishing it?
When this happens, it's kind of like we're sitting at the crossroads of like both of my lives. You know, we talked about before, Emily, my wife, she has to be a saint for dealing with this. You know, most people would say, like, oh, my wife, you know, she tolerates it during fishing season. Unfortunately, mine has to deal with it even more than that because I'm the, like Matt was talking about, I'm the planner. So, you know, if we're gonna fish it in May, usually like November, December, I'm driving her insane talking about it. So like the research aspect of it, you know, scientist for my career, the research is pretty important. I think that's a lot of fun. Again, the other thing we talked about before is just like I fish carp a ton during the year. It's so hard. It's my favorite frustration. You know, here I had to adapt the new name, so we call them prairie permit out here. So a little bit tougher to get, you know, as they are everywhere, and that complete shift is just really cool. I think that's the biggest enjoyment I get out of it. Is it's, you know, every time you do it, you can be 30 years old, however old people are doing it, and you know, it's like giggling every single time you do it because you're so used to a fish tailing, coming over and saying no to the size 8 damselfly nymph. And then this comes around and you've got 12 of them fighting over a size 4 dry fly. It's such a different experience. Like, I'm sure people are going to, you know, hear all this and hear people talk and say, oh, that sounds really cool. It's cooler than you can possibly imagine. You know, it basically turns a really big, hard fighting, spooky fish into like a giant bluegill in terms of how aggressive they can be. So it's just a wild transformation. Like you said, I've done it, I think 4 times now, 4 different broods. And every time it's just still a shock, even though I know it's going to be like that. That's really cool. And, you know, but I always try to get somebody new out to let them experience it too. You know, we've all got our buddies that fish and they want to do it. And we've done it with them years and years and years, but I always try to get somebody new. You know, if they're new to fly fishing, it's really cool. Even if they're not new to fly fishing, you know, showing them, you know, you want to see this fish, you know, kind of completely flip the switch. And I think that's the biggest part about it. It's such a different experience that, you know, comes around every 17 years. So you got to make the most of it when you can. But yeah, I think that would be the biggest one. Just like seeing the complete shift in it, and then getting to see people love a fish that they probably don't really think about that much is a really cool aspect of it.
That's really neat. That's a really good description. Well, as a tyer, you've got to get some really cool pictures and stories of people using your flies to kind of make pretty amazing memories, even if you're not there. Do any stand out to you? And, you know, honestly, hopefully we can make a few more this year with some of the bugs that we sell here in the shop.
Looking forward to seeing some carp shots. I saw a few people already buying them down there on the old Instagram. So that was cool to see. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I tell people, you know, I try to fish like 4 or 5 nights a week up here, but you know, during the days, and we'll talk about more of that too in a minute. But you know, when I'm not out working, I really like to get the pictures. You know, this year's been a really cool year. I had some friends down in Iowa do some pretty crazy trips. You know, I've got game changers in like peacock bass in the Amazon that have been cool. Had a guy take a bunch of flies over to Australia for like a month and was catching just wild stuff I've never heard about before, like queenfish and stuff like that in Australia. Had a guy, one of my professors from King, his cousin lives in Malaysia, and took some, you know, big giant clousers to Malaysia and caught, you know, some of the big crazy like purple and black like giant snakehead that we don't have yet here underlined. So that was pretty cool. You know, my specialty here is definitely like the, you know, smallmouth. So I get a ton of really big smallmouth. Really cool thing lately has kind of been, I'm sure you guys have seen it down there, this kind of shift to the oddball species in fly fishing. So we spent a ton of time this year targeting, again, different name for different area, bowfin or dogfish or mother-in-law fish, lawyer fish, cypress trout, you know, wherever you are. Spend a lot of time chasing those around. got some really cool pictures. Had a buddy today send me a picture while I was on lunch today that about a 30-pound common he caught on a R&D fly we've been working on. So that's been, it's a really cool thing. It kind of keeps me engaged all the time. The winters up here get pretty rough sometimes, so you really get to see the flies out in the world doing things. And that's why I was really happy to start working with you guys down there. Being a part of the community that raised me in fly fishing is really cool. Being able to see my flies still getting some work on the old home waters that's been really, really cool to see. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to get some of your shot too. So thank you again for that.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. We really appreciate it. And apart from just knowing a lot about cicadas, what else are you up to in Minnesota?
My full-time job is I work for a company called Metropolitan Mosquito Control District. So if you guys are familiar with Minnesota at all, or heard of like the Mall of America, the Minnesota Twins. So I am over the quality assurance program for one of the largest mosquito control districts in the world. So we treat about 3 million people in the area that we service. It's about the size of 2 state of Rhode Islands put side by side. So 3 million people in the area that we take care of. So I do a lot of basically environmental science. So are we killing what we're supposed to be killing, and are we not killing what we're not supposed to be? So targeting mosquitoes and black flies. Do a lot of work with ticks. So basically any insect or arthropod that can transmit diseases to people. I work a lot with that and trying to kill those in an environmentally conscious way. So I do a lot of non-target work. I get to spend a lot of time on the Mississippi River, a lot of the smaller creeks up here. So that's my kind of full-time gig. And then 2023, I started my guide service up here. So Reagle Beagle Fly Fishing is the name of that, named after my dog Wrigley. Today's her 6th birthday. So it's a big day to be a beagle in the house today. So I run Reagle Beagle Fly Fishing. Basically do full day guiding on the weekends and then a ton of weeknights each week too, usually. So we do mainly targeting smallmouth bass. So if you're not familiar with Minnesota, people always tend to think of it as kind of like the walleye capital of the world. And that's all anyone cares about up here. It's not far from off. But it's really cool. We have tremendous smallmouth fishery here. So people tend to associate the Mississippi River with, what it is further south, Old Muddy and Tom Sawyer and all that stuff, Huck Finn, that whole deal. But in Minnesota, where it actually starts, the headwaters of the Mississippi are in Minnesota. So it's pretty much crystal clear, almost looks like a trout stream in a lot of places that we fish it. But instead of trout, last year we had a smallmouth that was touch over 7 pounds.
Well,
so ton of smallmouth fishing. So that's mainly what I do. I run the same drift boats that you fish out of in Tennessee. So I run a clacker craft on the upper Mississippi here. Smallmouth are definitely my bread and butter. That's what I'm guiding for 90% of the time. We have a really cool program up here for buffalo, big mouth buffalo fish, which if you're not familiar with, you should look them up. They're a native fish to most of the country. They're not a carp. They eat dry flies. The average one's like 25, 30 pounds. So we get a ton of shots at those up here. And then you got your typical northern fish too. You got your pike and walleye, muskie, all that stuff up here like crazy too. So guiding pretty much May through November, December, depending on the weather. But yeah, drift boat fishing for a lot of different species, mostly fly fishing. But if people do want to do conventional, we can do that too. So yeah, mosquitoes by day and then fishing by evening and weekends right now.
Awesome. So for those of you, or for those who might want to reach out and talk to you about cicadas, inquire about flies, or talk to you about guide trips up in Minnesota, how should they get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you just Google the business name, Reagle Beagle Fly Fishing, you can get a lot coming up there. There's Instagram, there's Facebook, there is a website that you'll pull up there. If you want to get in touch with me, I have an Etsy page for flies, but I don't push people to it because I'm not very good at Etsy. So if there are flies that you want to do, just reach out to me directly through any of that. I'm sure you can link that stuff too once you post this, however you want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the email is easy too. It's just regalbeagleflyfishing@gmail.com. shoot me an email there, talk flies, talk about guiding. I have some people come up from Tennessee to fish quite a bit, so it's a decent drive from down there, but it's worth it. Smallmouth fishing up here is pretty incredible. You get to do it in a really cool environment, so that's pretty big sell to get up here. But yeah, any flies, any custom orders you want to do. I do a lot of trip specific packages for people heading, kind of all over the world. And then obviously would love to have people come up and spend a few days up here fishing with me too. But yeah, Reagle, Beagle, fly fishing on any of the social medias, and just at gmail.com for email. I'm pretty good about checking all of them. So whichever way you reach out, you should get me pretty quick.
Cool. Well, thanks a ton for taking the time tonight. You're clearly really passionate about this. You've put in a ton of time and effort, both on the water and in the library, and we really, really appreciate the time that you took to help share some of your knowledge and insight with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, John. Go Vols.
And how that fire's burning wild, but it can't keep up with your touch.